This is my backyard. It's my first glimpse of the natural world each day, and it's what I'm most familiar with when it comes to thinking about nature and the environment. Climate change and the environment are topics that I always hear about. But admittedly, it's not something that's always on the forefront of my mind, and climate anxiety isn't something that I commonly experience. I don't have to worry about my home being displaced by rising sea levels and growing factories, or worry about having detrimental health effects as a result of nearby industrial pollution, or worry about whether I'll survive the next incoming natural disaster. Yet, I come from a place that is on the front lines of these problems. This is me, circa 2001, taken in Manila, Philippines. I was born in the Philippines in 1999 and lived there until 2004, the year we uprooted our home from my dad's job and moved to the United States. Growing up, apart from navigating the cultural shock of being a foreigner in a new country and not knowing a single word of English, living in the United States was as simple as living in the United States. For me, climate change has always been a faraway topic, as in, melting ice caps don't necessarily affect my daily living, so I won't pay attention to it. But then I met Mitzi. Mitzi Janelle Tan is a full-time climate advocate based in the Philippines. I had listened to her talk on a Zoom conference a few months ago about how the growing climate crises has shifted the course of her life towards climate advocacy, and spending her time and efforts on the voices being directly affected. She's a leader in Fridays for Future Philippines, as well as YACAP, a national organization dedicated to giving a platform for the Filipino youth generation to take part in inciting global climate action. She's participated in numerous international conferences and has had a large voice in campaigns against leading polluting industries and destructive practices in the Philippines. All in all, she's a badass. I was lucky enough to be able to interview and talk with her personally about her experiences in climate advocacy, and in general, just her life in the Philippines. As someone who spent majority of their life away from their roots and heritage, there's definitely a lot that I don't know and honestly get a little FOMO about. So I love being able to hear her stories and what her life was like. In understanding the climate change in the Philippines and understanding Mitzi's work, we first have to get some background on the country itself and how the nation is doing currently. This is the Philippines. The Philippines is an island country made up of more than 7,500 islands. With a population of over 100 million people, the country ranges from huge metropolitans and tourist hotspots to indigenous towns and small fishing villages. Because the Philippines is solely made up of islands, it makes the country one of the most vulnerable places to global warming. Filipinos are highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, including rising sea level, extreme weather events and natural hazards, as well as rising temperatures and extreme rainfalls. The Philippines actually lies in the world's most cyclone-prone region, averaging 19 to 20 cyclones each year, 7 to 9 of which make landfall. Ironically, in Mitzi's words, the more extreme tropical cyclones are supposed to be once-in-a-lifetime experiences, yet the Philippines faces them at an accelerating rate, currently at an average of once every 5 years. The last time I visited the country was in 2015. We stayed for 2 weeks at our old house in Manila, spending time with our extended family and vacationing at tourist islands like Boracay and Coron. I had amazing experiences, whether it was immersed in the Filipino culture and roaming cities and major malls, or four-wheeling at dormant volcanoes and going scuba diving to sunken ships. But what wasn't on my mind was how all of this, the land, the people, the joy and everything I've known about my heritage, all of this is vulnerable to the destruction caused by our global impact on the climate. So as someone who's honestly only been more cognizant as of recently on what's been going on in the Philippines, and honestly in the broader sense, environmental advocacy, I want to know more about what climate change meant for someone who personally experiences it and understands what it's like facing the real dangers caused by centuries of environmental negligence.
I've always been very passionate about the environment. So growing up, it was something that I always felt very close to, and I did grow up seeing the typhoons and experiencing that firsthand. Um, but my environmental activism didn't really start until much later on, mostly because activism is seen as a taboo here, or you don't really have the right information to know that you can actually do something against climate change. Like the way it's taught is like, this is something that's happening, it's a scientific fact, which it is, but it doesn't empower you into doing anything more. So it is a very individual lifestyle kind of advocacy until in 2017, when I was able to talk to an indigenous leader of our land. So they're called the Lumad Indigenous Group. And they often get harassed and militarized and displaced from their lands. And so they take political refuge in universities to also tell their stories. And so we went to one of the indigenous leaders and we talked to him, and he was telling us about how they were being displaced and harassed and killed and militarized, all for protecting their lands and their environment. And then, ever so simply, he shrugged and chuckled and said, "That's why we have no choice but to fight back." And the simplicity of how he said it, just how there was no doubt, he wasn't even trying to convince us of anything. It was just a simple fact. That is what got to me. That is when I realized I had this privilege to choose to be an activist. And so I had to join the struggle of our indigenous peoples for a better planet, for a better future.
The more Mitzi and I talked, the more I realized that we're not that very different from each other. Mitzi's only a year older than me. She majored in math in college, I'm majoring in chemistry. We both invested our time and effort into something that are questionably, but more than likely not our passions. We both have adorable dogs, and we both spend a lot of time watching K-dramas on Netflix. These past few months, Mitzi has been working on a campaign against the UK bank Standard Chartered. They're one of the world's top funders of coal companies, and although they say they've stopped funding coal projects, they do fund the corporate loans to fossil fuels and coal companies. In Mitzi's words in her letter to the CEO of Standard Chartered Bank, Standard Chartered finances the pollution of our water, makes our air unbreathable, and toxifies the soil we live on. And so, while Mitzi has been advocating and protesting for our people and the voices unheard, what about me? What am I doing now? Well, I'm sitting in the comfort of my closet in North Carolina filming this documentary on the environmental crises happening at my home country, the Philippines, which is approximately 8,806 miles away. But honestly, if it weren't for Mitzi and hearing her story about growing up in one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, or my vulnerable country, I don't know if I would be as interested in environmental advocacy as I am now. As painful as it is to say, the disconnection I've always felt between my own life and my own Filipino culture extends further than just my broken Tagalog or ignorance in F-pop. It goes as far as not recognizing and not acting as a voice for my culture that is under the pressure of the effects of our global harm on the environment. I can't imagine what my life would be like if my family had never left the Philippines. Would I still be indifferent to the environment and to the societies being displaced by the natural disasters and expanding modern societies? Or in some alternate world, would I be in Mitzi's shoes, where mine and the people around me's lives are constantly under the threat of our environmental negligence, such that I can't function otherwise but to advocate for change? If it weren't for my own personal connection to the people being directly affected by the climate crisis, would I even be listening and prioritizing those voices now? In a way, this video is my personal letter to the Standard Chartered Bank. But rather than some external conglomerate that greedily benefits at the world's expense, this letter is a reminder and wake-up call to your average individual, to my future self, who has and will more than likely unknowingly also benefit at the world's expense.
People gonna rise like the water. We're gonna face this crisis now. I hear the voice of my great-granddaughter singing climate justice now. People gonna rise like the water. We're gonna tear this system down. I hear the voice of my great-granddaughter singing keep it in.